In the marble corridors of the northern palace, power moved like a predator through shadows, silent, ruthless, and utterly certain of its dominion. For 23 years, Prince Alaric had walked these halls believing himself untouchable, his birthright a shield against consequence, and his royal blood a license for cruelty. The servants who cleaned his chambers, the guards who bowed in his presence, the Omega maids who scurried like frightened mice when he passed, all were beneath his notice, except when they served his pleasure or absorbed his rage. Elmira had learned to make herself invisible in these corridors, to move through her duties with the ghostly efficiency of someone who understood that survival meant avoiding attention at all costs. As an Omega with no pack, no protector, and no voice that anyone cared to hear, she had accepted that her role was to endure whatever cruelty the powerful chose to inflict, to absorb their anger like a stone accepts rain, silently, completely, and without complaint. She had been taught that this was the natural order. Alphas commanded, betas obeyed, and omegas suffered. She had been told that questioning this hierarchy was not just futile but dangerous, that those who forgot their place risked consequences that could shatter lives like glass beneath a careless heel. So she had learned to be small, to be quiet, to swallow her pain and hide her tears until she could weep alone in the darkness where no one would witness her weakness. But some cruelties were too vicious to hide, and some moments of evil too profound to ignore. When the heir's rage found her alone in the servant's wing, when his fists became boots and his privilege became savagery, Elmira discovered that the very system designed to protect the powerful could sometimes expose them to judgment they never saw coming. In the Northern Kingdom, they whispered that the walls had eyes, and the stones had memory. They spoke of an ancient law carved in blood and honor, that those who wore crowns carried responsibilities as heavy as their rights, and that power without restraint was not strength, but the deadliest weakness of all. They never spoke of what happened when a king discovered his heir's true nature in a moment of unguarded brutality, or when an Omega's silent suffering finally found a witness powerful enough to demand justice. The corridor was about to become a courtroom, the prince was about to become the defendant, and the kingdom was about to learn that some reckonings could not be delayed, denied, or destroyed, only endured. The abuse was about to meet its match. The silence was about to be shattered, and everything the court thought it knew about power, privilege, and justice was about to change forever. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The servants' wing of the Northern Palace was designed to be forgotten. Tucked away beneath the grandeur of the staterooms and royal chambers, its narrow corridors and low-ceilinged chambers housed the silent army of workers who kept the kingdom's heart beating. Here, the marble gave way to rough stone, the crystal chandeliers to simple oil lamps, and the ornate tapestries to bare walls that had witnessed 1,000 small cruelties but never spoken of them. Elmira moved through these halls like a ghost made flesh, her worn gray dress whispering against the stone as she carried her cleaning supplies toward the northern tower. At 19, she had already learned to measure her life in moments of invisibility, the blessed stretches of time when she could perform her duties without attracting attention, when she could simply exist without being noticed by those who held the power to make her existence painful. Her bare feet made no sound on the cold floor as she navigated the maze of servants' passages that connected the palace's working areas. She knew every shortcut, every shadowed alcove, every route that would allow her to complete her tasks, while avoiding the main corridors where nobles might wander. It was a skill born of necessity, refined by 3 years of living as the lowest member of an already forgotten class. The Omega quarters where she slept were little more than a closet with a narrow cot and a single window that looked out onto the kitchen gardens. She owned nothing beyond the 2 dresses she alternated between, a pair of worn boots for winter, and her mother's silver locket, the only thing of value she possessed, though she kept it hidden beneath her collar, where curious eyes couldn't see it and grasping hands couldn't reach it. Her mother had died when Elmira was 16, carried off by the fever that swept through the servants' quarters every few years, like a grim reminder of how little their lives mattered to those above. Her father had never been named, a secret her mother took to her grave, leaving Elmira alone in a world that had no place for unclaimed Omega orphans. Elmira! The sharp voice of head housekeeper Matilda cut through her thoughts like a blade. The North Tower chambers need attention before midnight. Prince Alaric's guests will be retiring soon. and I want every surface spotless." "Yes, ma'am," Elmira replied with the automatic deference that had been drilled into her since childhood. She quickened her pace, balancing her bucket of cleaning supplies as she climbed the narrow stairs that led to the tower's guest quarters. The North Tower was one of the palace's finest areas, reserved for visiting dignitaries and high-ranking nobles who came to court the royal family's favor. Tonight, Prince Alaric was entertaining a delegation from the eastern provinces, young lords whose fathers controlled vast territories and whose loyalty the kingdom needed to maintain. The evening had begun with a formal dinner, progressed through several rounds of increasingly expensive wine, and was now winding toward the kind of late-night revelries that princes indulged in when they believed themselves beyond observation. Elmira could hear laughter and conversation echoing down the corridor as she approached the chambers she needed to clean. The sound made her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Drunk nobles were unpredictable, and their entertainment often came at the expense of whatever servants happened to be nearby when they needed someone to abuse. She paused at the end of the corridor, listening carefully to gauge the mood and location of the prince's party. The voices seemed to be coming from the main drawing room at the tower's center, which meant she should be able to clean the outer chambers without encountering anyone important. If she was quick and quiet, she could finish her work and retreat to the safety of the servants' wing before anyone noticed her presence. The first chamber was a sitting room, decorated in rich blue and gold, with furniture that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Elmira worked with practiced efficiency, dusting surfaces and straightening cushions with the kind of precision that came from knowing that any imperfection would result in punishment. She had learned to see dirt and disorder that others missed, to anticipate criticism before it could be voiced. As she worked, she tried not to think about the conversation she had overheard in the kitchens that morning, worried whispers among the older servants about increased tensions between the royal family and their noble supporters, about rumors of unrest in the outer provinces, about the possibility of changes to the palace hierarchy that might make life even more precarious for those at the bottom. The second chamber was a bedroom with windows that looked out over the palace gardens. Moonlight streamed through the glass, illuminating tapestries that depicted hunting scenes and battle victories. Elmira moved carefully around the ornate furniture, her movements automatic and silent as years of practice had taught her. She was reaching to dust a high shelf when the door behind her slammed open with enough force to rattle the windows. The sound startled her so badly that she nearly dropped her cleaning cloth, and she spun around to see Prince Alaric standing in the doorway with an expression of cold fury that made her blood freeze in her veins. Prince Alaric Ravencroft was everything that royal breeding programs were designed to produce. Tall, powerfully built, with the kind of classical features that painters immortalized in formal portraits. His dark hair was perfectly styled despite the evening's festivities, and his clothing bore the subtle marks of wealth and privilege that distinguished true nobility from mere pretenders. But it was his eyes that marked him as dangerous, pale blue like winter ice, holding intelligence and cruelty in equal measure. At 23, he had never been denied anything he truly wanted, never been forced to accept responsibility for his actions, never been taught that power carried obligations as well as privileges. He moved through the world with the casual arrogance of someone who had been told since birth that he was destined for greatness, and he had learned to take that greatness wherever he found it, regardless of who might be harmed in the process. "You," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made wise people step very carefully. "Turn around." Elmira immediately lowered her eyes and turned to face the wall, her hands clasping her cleaning cloth so tightly that her knuckles went white. This was the protocol she had been taught. Submit immediately, avoid eye contact, give no excuse for escalated anger. "Do you know why I'm here?" Prince Alaric asked, his footsteps moving closer across the stone floor. "No, Your Highness," Elmira whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here because one of my guests mentioned that his wine glass had water spots on it during dinner," the prince said conversationally. Water spots, on crystal that should have been perfect. Elmira's stomach dropped as she realized what was happening. Someone had made a mistake, perhaps in the kitchens, perhaps in the serving, perhaps simply in the prince's perception, and now she would pay the price for it. It didn't matter whether she had been responsible for the specific failing. She was Omega. She was available, and she was powerless to defend herself. "I'm sorry, Your Highness," she said, the words coming automatically. "It won't happen again." "No," Prince Alaric agreed, his voice taking on a tone of satisfied anticipation. "It won't." The first blow caught her across the shoulders, delivered with the casual efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of causing pain without leaving marks that would attract unwanted attention. Elmira stumbled forward but managed to keep her feet, biting down hard on her tongue to prevent any sound of pain from escaping. "Clumsy?" the prince observed clinically. "Do you know what happens to clumsy servants in this palace?" Before she could answer, his foot connected with her ribs with enough force to drive the air from her lungs. This time she did fall, hitting the stone floor hard enough to send shockwaves through her already aching body. "Please, Your Highness," she managed to gasp, though she knew begging would only encourage him. "I'll be more careful. Will you?" Prince Alaric circled her slowly, like a predator contemplating the best way to finish wounded prey. "I wonder, perhaps you need a lesson that will help you remember your place." His boot caught her in the stomach this time, a precise blow that sent waves of nausea through her system. Elmira curled into a protective ball, trying to shield her vital organs while presenting as small a target as possible. It was a skill she had learned during her first year in service, when she had been too naive to understand that fighting back would only make things worse. "Look at me," Prince Alaric commanded, his voice sharp with authority. Elmira forced herself to lift her head, meeting his eyes for just a moment before lowering her gaze again. What she saw in his pale blue stare chilled her more than the physical pain. Not anger or passion, but cold calculation and genuine enjoyment of her suffering. "Good," he said with satisfaction. "At least you can follow simple instructions. Now let's see if you can learn more complex lessons." He drew back his foot for another kick, and Elmira closed her eyes, bracing herself for the impact. In the silence of the chamber, she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears, and the distant sound of laughter from the prince's guests, who continued their revelries unaware of the cruelty being enacted just rooms away from their entertainment. But the blow never came. Instead, the silence was broken by a voice that carried the kind of absolute authority that made mountains bow and kingdoms tremble. "Alaric!" The single word, spoken with quiet fury, seemed to drain all the warmth from the chamber. Prince Alaric froze with his foot still raised, his face going pale as he recognized the voice that had interrupted his sport. Standing in the doorway like an avenging deity was Alpha King Roderick Ravencroft, his massive frame filling the entrance, and his storm-gray eyes fixed upon his son with an expression of such cold rage that the very air seemed to crystallize around them. The king was 52 years old, but the decades of rule had not diminished his physical presence, or the raw power that radiated from him like heat from a forge. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and his face bore the kind of weathered strength that came from making hard decisions and living with their consequences. He wore simple evening clothes rather than royal regalia, but his authority was so absolute that crowns would have been redundant. "Father," Prince Alaric said, his voice tight with surprise and growing fear. "There was a problem with the service tonight, and You were kicking an Omega who couldn't fight back," the king interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that preceded earthquakes. "In my palace, under my roof, while she performed the duties I assigned to her." The corridor outside the chamber had fallen silent as the king's presence was recognized by the guards and servants who worked these halls. Word would already be spreading through the palace's network of whispered communication. The Alpha King had caught his heir in an act of casual cruelty, and the consequences would ripple through the entire hierarchy. "She made a mistake," Prince Alaric protested, though his voice lacked conviction. The service tonight was perfect," Alpha King Roderick said with deadly calm. "I know, because I pay attention to such things. Unlike some, I don't rely on imagined slights to justify my entertainment." He stepped into the chamber, his presence seeming to make the spacious room feel suddenly cramped. Elmira, still curled on the floor, found herself caught between the two most powerful men in the kingdom, her pain and fear temporarily forgotten in the face of this unprecedented confrontation. "Get up," the king said to her, his voice gentling slightly, though it still carried unmistakable command. "Slowly. Are you badly injured?" Elmira struggled to her knees, then carefully to her feet, testing her ribs and finding that while movement was painful, nothing seemed to be broken. "No, Your Majesty," she whispered, though her voice shook with the effort of speaking. "Look at me," Alpha King Roderick commanded, and this time there was no cruelty in the order, only the kind of authority that demanded honesty. Elmira raised her eyes to meet the king's gaze, and what she saw there surprised her. Not the cold calculation she had learned to expect from those in power, but genuine anger on her behalf, and something that might have been respect for her composure under such circumstances. "How long has this been happening?" he asked quietly. The question hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Elmira glanced toward Prince Alaric, whose face had gone white with the realization of what his father was asking, then back to the king's steady gaze. "Your Majesty," she began carefully. That is, answer truthfully," the king said with gentle authority. "You have nothing to fear from honesty in my presence." Elmira took a shaking breath, understanding that this moment would define not just her future, but possibly the future of everyone who served in the palace's shadows. "This is the first time Prince Alaric has noticed me, Your Majesty. But such things, they happen to servants. It's considered normal." The simple statement fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of implication in all directions. The king's expression darkened further as he processed not just what had happened tonight, but what was happening regularly throughout his domain. "Normal," he repeated, the word carrying enough disgust to poison the air. "Beating servants is considered normal in my palace." "Father," Prince Alaric said desperately, "you don't understand the pressures of leadership, the need to maintain discipline." "I understand," Alpha King Roderick interrupted with terrible calm, "that my son believes leadership means terrorizing those too weak to defend themselves. I understand that the heir to my throne considers cruelty to be entertainment and abuse to be discipline." He turned to face his son directly, and the weight of his disappointed gaze made Prince Alaric step backward involuntarily. "Most importantly," the king continued, his voice dropping to the kind of whisper that preceding avalanches, "I understand that everything I thought I had taught you about honor, responsibility, and the obligations of power has been completely wasted. What happened next would be discussed in palace corridors for generations to come." Alpha King Roderick, the most powerful man in the Northern Kingdom, slowly and deliberately removed the insignia of rank from his son's clothing, the golden pin that marked him as heir apparent, the ceremonial dagger that symbolized his authority, the silver cord that identified him as a prince of the realm. "By my authority as Alpha King of the Northern Territories," he said formally, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent tower, "I hereby strip Prince Alaric Ravencroft of all military command, all administrative authority, and all privileges of rank, pending a formal investigation into his fitness to inherit the crown." The words hit Prince Alaric like physical blows, each formal phrase stripping away another layer of the identity he had built his entire life around. "You can't," he whispered. "I'm your heir. I'm your only son. You are a stranger wearing my son's face," Alpha King Roderick replied with finality. "The son I raised would never have lifted his hand against someone helpless. The heir I trained would have died before dishonoring his bloodline with such cowardice." As guards appeared to escort the former prince from the chamber, Alpha King Roderick turned his attention back to Elmira, who had watched this unprecedented display of royal justice with growing amazement and terror in equal measure. "Miss," he said formally, "I owe you an apology on behalf of the crown, and a debt that will not be easily repaid. Will you accept my protection while we determine how such failures of leadership are to be addressed?" Elmira stared at the king, this man whose word could reshape kingdoms and whose anger could level mountains, and realized that her life had just changed in ways she could never have imagined. The silence she had maintained for so long was about to be broken, and the truth of what happened in the palace's shadows was about to be dragged into the light. "Yes, Your Majesty," she whispered, and with those simple words, a reckoning began that would shake the foundations of the Northern Kingdom and force everyone from the highest noble to the lowest servant to confront the difference between power and justice. The dawn that followed the night of reckoning arrived cold and gray over the Northern Palace, its pale light filtering through windows that seemed to regard the world with different eyes than they had the evening before. In the space of a few hours, everything that had seemed immutable about the kingdom's hierarchy had been called into question, and the palace stirred to life with an undercurrent of tension that even the most oblivious courtiers could not ignore. Elmira sat in a chamber she had never dreamed of entering, a guest room in the noble wing, with actual windows that let in natural light, furniture that existed for comfort rather than mere function, and a bed large enough that she could stretch out completely without her feet hanging over the edge. The royal physician had examined her injuries the night before, declaring them painful, but not serious, and prescribed rest that she was finding impossible to achieve. Every sound in the corridor outside made her start. Every footstep could herald either salvation or disaster. The protection the king had offered felt as fragile as morning mist, easily dispersed by political necessity or royal reconsideration. She had seen enough of palace life to know that promises made in anger could be forgotten when cooler heads prevailed. A soft knock at her door interrupted her troubled thoughts, followed by the entrance of a woman Elmira recognized, but had never spoken to. Lady Cordelia Ashworth, the king's personal secretary, and one of the few people in the palace who commanded respect through competence rather than bloodline. Lady Cordelia was perhaps 40 years old, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical style, and intelligent brown eyes that missed very little of what went on around her. She had served 3 generations of the royal family, and was rumored to know more about governing the kingdom than most of the official advisors. "Miss Elmira," she said with a courtesy that would have been unthinkable just days ago, "His Majesty has requested your presence in his private study. Are you feeling well enough to attend him?" "Yes, my lady," Elmira replied, rising carefully from her chair and testing her balance. The bruises on her ribs pulled with each movement, but she was functional. That is, what should I expect?" Lady Cordelia's expression softened slightly as she recognized the genuine fear behind the question. "His Majesty wishes to speak with you about last night's events and their implications for the palace's governance. You will find him fair but thorough in his inquiries. He is not a man who makes decisions lightly, particularly when they concern justice." As they walked through corridors that Elmira had only glimpsed before, Lady Cordelia maintained a steady stream of quiet instruction about palace protocols, proper forms of address, and what to expect from an audience with the king. But beneath the practical guidance, Elmira sensed something else, a careful assessment that suggested her future was being evaluated by someone whose opinion might prove crucial. "Tell me," Lady Cordelia said as they approached the royal wing, "how long have you worked in the palace?" 3 years, my lady," Elmira replied, automatically falling into the deferential tone that 3 years of service had ingrained in her, "since my mother's death. And in those 3 years, have you observed other incidents similar to what occurred last night?" The question was asked casually, but Elmira sensed the weight behind it. This was not idle curiosity, but information gathering of the most serious kind. "Yes, my lady," she said carefully. Not necessarily from Prince Alaric himself, but from others. It's considered normal, as I told His Majesty." "Normal," Lady Cordelia repeated with distaste. "Yes, I'm beginning to understand the scope of the problem we're facing. The king's investigation will be quite thorough, I believe." They paused outside massive oak doors that bore the royal coat of arms, flanked by guards whose expressions suggested they had heard about the previous night's events, and were still processing their implications. Lady Cordelia knocked once, waited for permission to enter, then gestured for Elmira to follow her into the seat of power itself. The king's private study was smaller than Elmira had expected, but infinitely more imposing. 3 walls were lined floor to ceiling with books that spoke of scholarship as well as authority, while the 4th wall held windows that looked out over the kingdom's capital city. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with documents that represented the complex business of governing a realm. Alpha King Roderick stood behind the desk, still wearing the simple clothing he had donned the night before, but somehow managing to project more authority in his informal attire than most men could muster in full royal regalia. His storm-gray eyes fixed on Elmira as she entered, and she found herself surprised by the absence of the cold calculation she had learned to expect from powerful men. "Miss Elmira," he said formally, gesturing to a chair that had been positioned facing his desk. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." She took the offered chair with careful grace, noting that it had been positioned at a height that allowed her to meet the king's eyes without having to crane her neck, a small consideration that spoke of thoughtfulness rather than mere protocol. "I trust you slept well?" the king asked, though his tone suggested he suspected otherwise. "Yes, your majesty," Elmira lied politely, unwilling to seem ungrateful for the unprecedented luxury she had been offered. "Miss Elmira," Alpha King Roderick said gently but firmly, "I am about to ask you questions that may be difficult to answer. I want you to understand that complete honesty will serve both of us better than polite evasion. Can you do that for me?" The request was phrased as a question, but Elmira understood it as the royal command it truly was. "Yes, your majesty." "Good." The king moved around his desk and took a chair that faced hers, eliminating the symbolic barrier between them. "Tell me about life in the servants' quarters." Not the official version that appears in palace reports, but the reality that you and your fellow workers experience daily. The question opened floodgates that Elmira had kept sealed for 3 years. Once she began speaking, the words poured out with the force of water through a broken dam. Stories of casual cruelty, systematic abuse, and the culture of silence that protected perpetrators while abandoning victims. She spoke of servants who disappeared after attracting the wrong kind of attention, of injuries that were never reported because reporting them would only result in worse punishment, of the unwritten rules that governed survival in the palace's forgotten corners. Alpha King Roderick listened without interruption, his face growing increasingly grim as the scope of the problem became clear. When Elmira finally fell silent, emotionally exhausted by the recitation of horrors she had kept hidden for so long, he sat in contemplation for several moments before speaking. "How many servants are we talking about?" he asked finally. "Nearly 200 in the palace itself, Your Majesty," Elmira replied. "Perhaps half again that number in the immediate grounds and royal facilities throughout the capital. And how many of them have experienced or witnessed the kind of abuse you've described?" Elmira considered the question carefully. "Most of us, Your Majesty. The lucky ones are those who have learned to be invisible enough that they're rarely noticed. But luck runs out eventually." The king's jaw tightened as he processed this information. "And none of this has ever been reported to the proper authorities?" "Reported to whom, Your Majesty?" Elmira asked, with the careful courage of someone who had nothing left to lose. "The head housekeeper knows and considers it normal. The guard captains know and view it as maintaining discipline. The nobles who commit such acts know they have nothing to fear from servants with no voice and no protection. Until last night," Alpha King Roderick said quietly. "Until last night," Elmira agreed. "But Your Majesty, if I may, what happens when the shock of discovering such things wears off? When the political calculations and family loyalties reassert themselves? Prince Alaric is still your heir. I am still just a servant. The balance of power hasn't really changed." The king studied her with new interest, clearly surprised by the political sophistication hidden beneath her humble exterior. "You believe that justice is temporary, but power is permanent?" "I believe that nothing I've seen in 3 years of palace life gives me reason to expect otherwise," Elmira replied honestly. Alpha King Roderick rose and moved to the window, staring out at the city where hundreds of thousands of his subjects lived their daily lives. "Miss Elmira," he said without turning around, "what would you say if I told you that last night's events have forced me to confront the possibility that my son is fundamentally unfit to inherit the crown?" The question struck Elmira like a physical blow. "Your Majesty, I'm not qualified to judge matters of royal succession." "Perhaps not," the king agreed, turning to face her again. "But you are qualified to judge character, and you've had the opportunity to observe both my son and the culture that shaped him. In your opinion, is Prince Alaric capable of the kind of leadership this kingdom deserves?" Elmira felt the weight of the question pressing down upon her like a mountain. This was not idle curiosity or philosophical speculation. The king was genuinely considering whether to disinherit his only heir, based partly on her assessment. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "I have observed that Prince Alaric treats those beneath him as objects for his convenience or amusement. I have seen that he considers cruelty to be entertainment and power to be permission for any behavior he chooses. But I have also seen that he is intelligent, charismatic, and capable of inspiring loyalty among his peers." "A diplomatic answer," the king observed, "but not a complete one." Elmira took a deep breath, understanding that this moment might determine not just her own fate, but the future of the kingdom itself. "In my opinion, Your Majesty, Prince Alaric has never learned that true leadership requires serving those you govern rather than exploiting them. Without that understanding, intelligence becomes manipulation, charisma becomes deception, and the loyalty he inspires becomes fear disguised as devotion." The silence that followed her words stretched for what felt like eternity. Alpha King Roderick studied her with an intensity that made her feel as though he was reading her very soul, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. "You speak with remarkable insight for someone so young," he said finally. "Tell me, Miss Elmira, what do you know of your own family history?" The change of subject caught her off guard. "Very little, Your Majesty. My mother told me that my father was a traveling merchant who died before I was born. She never spoke much about her own family, and she took most of her secrets to the grave." "Did she ever mention the name Blackthorn?" the king asked with studied casualness. Elmira's hand moved instinctively to the silver locket hidden beneath her collar, the only inheritance her mother had left her. She used to sing me lullabies that mentioned that name, Your Majesty, but I always assumed they were just songs. May I see the locket you wear? Alpha King Roderick asked gently. With trembling fingers, Elmira pulled the silver pendant from beneath her dress and opened it to reveal the miniature portrait inside. A woman with her own features, but wearing clothing that suggested nobility rather than servitude. The king's expression changed dramatically as he studied the tiny painting. Lady Catherine Blackthorne, he said quietly. Your grandmother, unless I'm very much mistaken. Your Majesty? Elmira whispered, not daring to believe what his words seemed to imply. The Blackthorne family served this crown with distinction for 5 generations, Alpha King Roderick explained. Lady Catherine was my father's trusted advisor, and one of the most intelligent women of her generation. She disappeared 30 years ago under mysterious circumstances, along with her daughter, your mother, I believe. The revelation hit Elmira like lightning, illuminating connections she had never suspected, and raising questions she had never thought to ask. But why? Why would they disappear? And why was I never told? Because, the king said with growing anger that was clearly not directed at her. Someone wanted to ensure that Lady Catherine's granddaughter grew up as a powerless servant rather than a nobleman's heir. Someone wanted to guarantee that the Blackthorne bloodline would never again pose a threat to their own political ambitions. As the implications of what he was telling her began to sink in, Elmira realized that the previous night's events had been about far more than a prince's cruelty or a king's justice. Forces had been set in motion that reached back decades, and the simple Omega Maid who had been kicked by a royal heir was about to discover that her own story was far more complex than she had ever imagined. What happens now, Your Majesty? She asked, though she suspected the answer would change everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. Now, Alpha King Roderick said, with the kind of determination that had built kingdoms and toppled empires. We uncover the truth about your family's disappearance. We hold accountable those who have abused their power, and we ensure that justice is not just a temporary inconvenience, but a permanent transformation. He moved to his desk and began pulling out documents that looked ancient and official. Miss Elmira, or should I say, Lady Catherine, you are about to learn that some reckonings are 30 years in the making, and some truths are powerful enough to reshape the very foundations of the throne itself. As the morning sun climbed higher outside the windows, casting light on secrets that had been hidden for decades, Elmira began to understand that her suffering had served a purpose she had never suspected. It had preserved her bloodline for a moment, when the kingdom would need her most, and it had taught her lessons about justice and leadership that no royal education could provide. The reckoning that had begun with a prince's cruelty was about to become a revolution that would challenge everything the Northern Kingdom thought it knew about power, inheritance, and the true cost of justice. The revelation of Elmira's true identity sent shockwaves through the palace that rippled outward like stones cast into still water. By afternoon, word had spread through the noble corridors that the Omega Maid beaten by Prince Alaric was, in fact, the missing heir to one of the kingdom's most distinguished bloodlines. The political implications were staggering, and those who had built their power on the old order began to understand that they were facing not just a king's momentary anger, but a fundamental shift in the balance of power itself. Elmira, Lady Catherine, as she was learning to think of herself, sat in the palace library, surrounded by genealogical records, family histories, and legal documents that painted a picture of deliberate conspiracy, stretching back 3 decades. Alpha King Roderick worked beside her, his scholarly attention to detail revealing depths of character that his public persona rarely displayed. Together, they were assembling the pieces of a puzzle that had been carefully scattered to prevent exactly this kind of discovery. Here, the king said, pointing to a passage in a leather-bound ledger, the record of your grandmother's last official act as my father's advisor. She was investigating irregularities in the Eastern Province taxation records, evidence of systematic embezzlement that would have destroyed several prominent noble families. Elmira traced the elegant handwriting with her finger, trying to reconcile the formal language of royal administration with the grandmother she had never known existed. And she disappeared just days before presenting her findings to your father, along with all her research and your mother, Alpha King Roderick confirmed grimly. The investigation was quietly shelved after their disappearance, and the matter was never pursued again. At the time, It was assumed to be an unfortunate coincidence. Now it looks like murder made to appear like voluntary exile, Elmira finished, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were discovering. But why let my mother live? Why not eliminate the entire bloodline? The king was quiet for several moments, studying documents with the intensity of a scholar solving an ancient riddle. Because, he said finally, your mother was pregnant when they disappeared. The conspirators couldn't risk killing a pregnant woman. Even corrupt nobles have their limits. But they could ensure that her child grew up powerless and ignorant of her true heritage. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. Someone with access to royal records and significant influence had orchestrated not just the disappearance of the Blackthorn family, but the systematic suppression of any investigation into their fate. Someone who had benefited enormously from the silence that followed, who had risen to positions of greater authority in the vacuum left by Lady Catherine's removal. Lord Malreth, Alpha King Roderick said suddenly, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from connecting the final elements of a long-standing mystery. Elmira looked up from the documents she was studying. Your Majesty, Lord Cornelius Malreth, current Chancellor of the Eastern Provinces and one of my most trusted advisors, the king explained, his expression darkening with each word. He was a minor functionary 30 years ago, but he rose rapidly in the administration after your grandmother's disappearance. He now controls exactly the territories and revenue streams that Lady Catherine was investigating. The name meant nothing to Elmira, but she could see its significance written in the king's increasingly grim expression. He's been here all along? In the palace? Advising you? Knowing what he had done? More than that, Alpha King Roderick said, rising to pace the length of the library with predatory intensity. He's been shaping policy, influencing decisions, and... The king stopped abruptly as another connection became clear. He's been mentoring my son. The implications hit them both simultaneously. Prince Alaric's cruelty, his sense of entitlement, his belief that power granted unlimited license for abuse, all of it had been carefully cultivated by someone who understood that a corrupt heir would serve his purposes better than an honorable one. Your Majesty, Elmira said carefully, if Lord Malreth has been Prince Alaric's primary advisor, then last night's incident may not have been simply the action of a spoiled prince. It may have been a test. Alpha King Roderick turned to stare at her with growing alarm. A test of what? Of whether you would protect a servant against your own heir, Elmira replied, her mind working through the political calculations with clarity that surprised even her. If you had ignored the abuse or punished me for reporting it, Lord Malreth would have known that you were either unaware of his activities or unwilling to challenge them. Either way, he could have continued operating with impunity. But because I stripped Alaric of his rank and began this investigation, you forced him to accelerate whatever plans he had for consolidating power, Elmira finished. Your Majesty, I think you may have just triggered a coup attempt. The words hung in the air between them like a death sentence. If Elmira's analysis was correct, then Lord Malreth wasn't just a corrupt administrator. He was a traitor who had spent 3 decades positioning himself to seize control of the kingdom, using Prince Alaric as his unwitting weapon and the murdered Blackthorn family as his stepping stones to power. We need proof, Alpha King Roderick said, with the grim determination of a warrior preparing for battle. Suspicion and logical deduction won't be enough to move against someone of Malreth's stature. We need evidence that even his supporters can't dismiss. Before Elmira could respond, the library doors burst open with enough force to rattle the ancient hinges. Prince Alaric strode in with a small entourage of noble supporters, his face flushed with anger and what might have been desperation. The former heir had clearly not spent the night quietly accepting his fall from grace. Father, Prince Alaric said without preamble, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, I demand an explanation for this madness. You've stripped me of rank based on the word of a servant, the word of Lady Catherine Blackthorn, rightful heir to one of this kingdom's most distinguished bloodlines, Alpha King Roderick interrupted with deadly calm, and you are no longer in a position to demand anything from me. The correction struck Prince Alaric like a physical blow. He turned to stare at Elmira, with an expression that cycled through disbelief, rage, and something approaching fear as the political implications became clear to him. That's impossible, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. She's a servant, a nobody. She can't just become nobility because you will it so. She was always nobility, the king replied evenly. She was simply prevented from claiming her birthright by those who found her powerlessness convenient. Behind Prince Alaric, Elmira could see the faces of his supporters processing this revelation and beginning to calculate how it might affect their own positions. These were political creatures who understood that backing the wrong side in royal family disputes could prove fatal to their ambitions. Lord Chancellor Malreth explained everything to me, Prince Alaric said desperately. This is all part of some elaborate scheme to undermine my inheritance. The girl is obviously an imposter, coached to play this role to Lord Malreth, Alpha King Roderick repeated with dangerous quiet. And what exactly did the Lord Chancellor explain to you? Too late. Prince Alaric seemed to realize he had said more than he intended. His face went pale as he understood that he had just connected himself directly to the man who was rapidly becoming the primary suspect in a decades-old conspiracy. He simply helped me understand the political pressures you might be facing. Prince Alaric backtracked frantically. The need to appear decisive in the face of criticism about palace discipline. But the damage was done. Alpha King Roderick's expression had shifted from disappointment in his son to something far more dangerous, recognition of betrayal, and the cold fury of a king discovering that his heir had been compromised by his enemies. Remove him from my sight, the king commanded the guards, who had followed Prince Alaric into the library, and summon Lord Malreth immediately. Tell him his counsel is urgently required on matters of royal succession. As Prince Alaric was escorted from the library, no longer with the deference due to an heir, but with the firm efficiency used for potential threats, Elmira found herself alone with the king and the terrible knowledge that they were about to face the man responsible for her family's destruction. Your Majesty, she said quietly, what if he refuses to come? What if he's already fled the kingdom? Alpha King Roderick smiled with the predatory satisfaction of a chess master who had just forced his opponent into checkmate. Then he confirms his guilt and loses any chance of talking his way out of the evidence we've assembled. But I don't think he'll flee. Why not? Because Lord Malreth has spent 30 years building his power base in this kingdom. He won't abandon it lightly, and he'll believe he can manipulate the situation to his advantage. Men like him always believe they're the smartest person in the room. And if he tries to have us killed rather than risk exposure, the king's expression grew even grimmer. Then he'll discover that some reckonings are inevitable, and that the crown has resources he's never suspected. As they waited for the confrontation that would determine the kingdom's future, Elmira found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From powerless servant to the center of a conspiracy that reached to the very heart of royal authority. The kicks and blows that Prince Alaric had delivered the previous night had been intended to reinforce her powerlessness, but they had instead awakened forces that would reshape the very foundations of the kingdom. Lady Catherine, Alpha King Roderick said formally, using her true name with an authority that made it real in a way that mere documents could not. Are you prepared to face the man who murdered your family and stole your inheritance? Elmira, Lady Catherine, straightened in her chair, feeling the weight of her bloodline's legacy settling upon her shoulders like armor. Yes, Your Majesty. I'm ready to see justice done. The library doors opened once more, and Lord Cornelius Malreth entered with the confident bearing of a man who believed himself untouchable. Tall, distinguished, with silver hair and intelligent dark eyes, he looked exactly like what he was, a capable administrator who had served the crown with apparent distinction for 3 decades. But Elmira could see beneath the polished exterior now. In his eyes, she glimpsed the calculation and ruthless ambition that had driven him to murder, betrayal, and treason. This was the man who had ordered her grandmother's death, who had corrupted Prince Alaric, who had spent decades positioning himself to steal a kingdom through patient manipulation and systematic elimination of obstacles. Your Majesty, Lord Malreth said with a respectful bow that seemed perfectly sincere, I understand there have been some concerning developments regarding Prince Alaric's behavior. I stand ready to assist in resolving this unfortunate situation. Indeed you do, Alpha King Roderick replied with deceptive mildness. Lord Malreth, I'd like you to meet Lady Catherine Blackthorne, granddaughter of your predecessor and, I believe, someone you thought you would never have to face again. The recognition that flashed across Lord Malreth's features lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to confirm every suspicion they had developed. For 30 years, He had believed the Blackthorn bloodline was safely buried in obscurity. Now he faced the living proof that some truths could not be hidden forever. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, his political instincts taking over even as his mind raced to assess this unexpected development. "I'm afraid I don't understand. The Blackthorn family disappeared decades ago, and I was under the impression that their line had ended." "Were you?" the king asked with dangerous softness. "How fascinating. Because according to the records we've been reviewing, you were quite instrumental in ensuring that impression became accepted fact." The final confrontation between justice and corruption was about to begin, and Elmira understood that the next few minutes would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone who had ever suffered under the assumption that power could act with impunity. The reckoning that had begun with a prince's cruelty was about to reach its climax in the exposure of a conspiracy that had shaped the kingdom for an entire generation. The moment of truth had arrived, and with it, the answer to whether justice was strong enough to overcome 30 years of careful corruption and systematic abuse of power. 6 months later, the autumn light that streamed through the tall windows of the royal council chamber cast a golden glow over proceedings that would have been unthinkable just half a year before. Lady Catherine Blackthorn sat at the polished oak table that had once seemed as distant as the stars, her voice carrying clear and confident as she presented her quarterly report on the palace reform initiatives that had transformed the very foundations of royal governance. "The servant protection protocols have reduced reported incidents of abuse by 92%, she said, her gaze moving across the assembled council members with the natural authority that had emerged once she embraced her true heritage. "More importantly, servants are now reporting incidents when they occur, rather than suffering in silence. We've established 3 separate channels for anonymous complaints, and each one is investigated by an independent committee." Alpha King Roderick nodded with satisfaction from his position at the head of the table. The past 6 months had aged him in some ways. The discovery of how thoroughly corruption had penetrated his kingdom had taken its toll, but they had also revealed reserves of strength and wisdom that had impressed even his most experienced advisors. "And the educational initiatives?" asked Lady Cordelia, who had assumed many of Lord Malreth's former administrative responsibilities with significantly better results. "Exceeding all projections," Lady Catherine replied with quiet pride. "We've established literacy programs in every wing of the palace, trade apprenticeships for those who show aptitude, and a scholarship fund for servants' children who demonstrate academic potential. The investment in human capital is already paying dividends in improved efficiency and loyalty throughout the royal household." The transformation had been comprehensive and, surprisingly, had met with less resistance than anyone had anticipated, perhaps because the revelations about Lord Malreth's conspiracy had shocked the nobility into recognizing how badly their system had failed, or perhaps because the economic and social benefits of treating servants as valuable human beings had proven impossible to argue against. Lord Malreth himself was no longer a concern. The evidence of his crimes, treason, murder, embezzlement, and systematic corruption, had been overwhelming once investigators began pulling at the threads Elmira and the king had identified. His trial had lasted 3 days, his execution another 3 minutes, and his extensive network of accomplices had either fled the kingdom or thrown themselves upon royal mercy. "What news from Prince Alaric?" Lady Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Still serving with distinction in the Eastern Border Guard," the king replied, with careful neutrality. "His commanding officer reports that hard work and genuine responsibility have clarified his understanding of leadership considerably. The decision to exile the former heir to military service rather than stripping him of royal blood entirely had been controversial, but ultimately wise. Away from the corrupting influences of court politics and forced to earn respect through competence rather than birthright, Alaric was slowly learning what his father had tried to teach him years too late. Whether he would ever be ready to return to the succession remained an open question, but he was at least becoming the man he should have been all along. "And the eastern provinces themselves?" Lady Cordelia inquired. "How are they adjusting to the new administrative structure?" "Better than expected," Lady Catherine replied. "Removing the systematically corrupt officials and replacing them with merit-based appointments has actually improved both governance and tax collection. The provinces are reporting higher satisfaction with royal authority than they've shown in decades." It was true. The comprehensive investigation that had followed Lord Malreth's exposure had revealed corruption so extensive that cleaning it out had been like lancing an infected wound. Painful, but ultimately healing. The new administrators, chosen for competence rather than political connections, were proving far more effective at actually governing their territories. "There is one matter," Alpha King Roderick said, his tone shifting to something more formal, "that we need to address before concluding today's session." He rose from his chair and moved to a window that looked out over the palace gardens, where servants now worked with the dignity of valued employees, rather than the fearful efficiency of potential victims. "Lady Catherine," he said without turning around, "you have exceeded every expectation in your role as special advisor for administrative reform. Your bloodline gifts for understanding people and systems have proven invaluable to the Crown's efforts to govern more effectively and justly." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Lady Catherine replied, though she sensed there was more coming. "Which is why," the king continued, turning to face her with an expression of paternal warmth mixed with royal authority, "I am formally offering you a permanent position in the royal family, not as an advisor or administrator, but as my adopted daughter and heir apparent to the throne." The silence that followed was profound. Lady Catherine stared at the king with an expression that cycled through shock, wonder, and something approaching fear as the implications of what he was offering became clear. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "I am deeply honored, but surely Prince Alaric may yet prove himself worthy of forgiveness and eventual restoration," Alpha King Roderick interrupted gently. "But the kingdom cannot wait for possibilities when it needs certainties. You have demonstrated the character, wisdom, and competence necessary to rule justly and effectively. More importantly, you understand what it means to serve those you govern rather than exploit them." Lady Catherine rose from her chair, her mind racing through the personal and political ramifications of such an unprecedented offer. To go from powerless servant to heir apparent in 6 months would be remarkable enough, but to do so while maintaining the respect and support of both nobles and commoners was something else entirely. "The nobles will accept this?" she asked. "The nobles will accept it because they've seen the alternative," Lady Cordelia observed dryly. "Corruption, rebellion, economic decline, and social unrest. Your reforms have made their own lives more prosperous and secure. They're not about to argue with success. And the people already see you as their champion," the king said with a smile. "The servant who stood up to a prince and brought justice to the kingdom. Your coronation would be the most popular royal celebration in living memory." Lady Catherine moved to the window herself, looking out at the transformed palace grounds where her life had changed so dramatically. In the distance, she could see servants tending gardens with the pride of skilled craftsmen, children playing games that included laughter rather than fear, and guards whose presence protected rather than intimidated. "If I accept," she said quietly, "what happens to the reforms we've implemented? What guarantee is there that future rulers won't simply revert to the old ways?" "You make them part of the kingdom's fundamental law," Alpha King Roderick replied. "Constitutional protections that can't be changed by royal whim or political expediency. Rights that belong to all citizens regardless of their station. A legal framework that ensures justice isn't dependent on the personal character of individual rulers." The vision he described was ambitious beyond anything the kingdom had ever attempted. A true transformation from absolute monarchy to constitutional governance, with protections for the powerless built into the very structure of royal authority. "It would take years to implement properly," Lady Catherine mused. "Decades," the king agreed. "Which is why the kingdom needs a ruler who understands both the destination and the journey, who has personally experienced both powerlessness and power, who knows the difference between authority earned and authority inherited." Lady Catherine was quiet for several minutes, contemplating the weight of what was being offered and what it would cost to accept. Finally, she turned back to face the assembled council, her expression resolute with decision. "I accept," she said formally, "on the condition that the constitutional protections Your Majesty described become my first priority as heir apparent. I want legal guarantees that no servant will ever again suffer abuse in silence, that power comes with accountability, and that justice is stronger than privilege." "Agreed," Alpha King Roderick said with evident satisfaction. "Lady Catherine Blackthorne, I name you Crown Princess of the Northern Territories and my chosen heir, with all the rights, responsibilities, and authority that title entails." As the council members rose to offer their formal recognition of the kingdom's new heir, Lady Catherine found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been kicked by a prince who saw her as entertainment. Today, she was about to become a queen who would ensure that such cruelty became not just illegal, but unthinkable. The transformation had cost much: Prince Alaric's inheritance, Lord Malreth's life, the comfortable assumptions that had governed the kingdom for generations. But it had purchased something invaluable. A future where power served justice rather than personal whim, where the weakest citizens had protections as strong as legal documents could provide, and where the crown's authority rested on earned respect rather than inherited privilege. That evening, as Crown Princess Catherine stood on the palace balcony overlooking the capital city, where hundreds of thousands of her future subjects lived their daily lives, she reflected on the cruel irony that had shaped her destiny. Prince Alaric's attempt to demonstrate his power over a helpless servant had instead revealed the corruption at the heart of the kingdom and provided the catalyst for its healing. Some kicks landed harder on the one who delivered them than on their intended victim. Some cruelty destroyed the cruel rather than the innocent. And some reckonings, once begun, reshaped not just individual lives, but the very foundations of justice itself. The Omega Maid was gone, transformed into the crown princess, who would rule with the hard-won wisdom of someone who had learned power's true cost through powerlessness itself. The kingdom's future stretched ahead, bright with the promise of justice earned rather than justice hoped for. And in the servants' quarters below, children slept safely for the first time in generations, protected by laws that had been written in their defense and enforced by a crown that finally understood the difference between ruling over subjects and serving citizens. The reckoning was complete, but the work of justice had only just begun. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.